Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast. We cover everything Major League, from spring training to the World Series. We've got your favorite club covered, from New York to Boston to LA. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast.
Welcome into another edition of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik, and this is episode number 202 of the Baseball Podcast. That's right, we are over the 200 mark. Episode 202 today on Thursday, July 2nd. We've made it officially to the calendar month of July, where there will be regular season Major League Baseball being played. I know it's felt like forever since March when the shutdown happened. We're going to hit the 4-month mark here very shortly, and soon after that, baseball will be back. But before we dive into all of that, I wanted to wish everybody out there a happy belated Bobby Bonilla Day. I'm recording this late Wednesday night. Today is still Bobby Bonilla Day, where the Mets pay Bobby $1.2 million. They do it every July 1st, and this will continue until the year 2035. So still 15 more years, 15 more anniversaries of Bobby Bonilla Day. He retired all the way back in 2001 and will be getting paid through 2035. So just diving into it a little bit here. I always forget the story when it pops up, and I say to myself, how can you pay somebody 30 years later? And then doing a little bit of research, the Mets got caught up in the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme, and the owners at the time were supposed to get a certain return on investment, so they thought deferring contracts because they were going to make more money elsewhere would be the smart move, since essentially we're going to make more than we lose and we'll be in the plus instead of just paying out cash. Well, of course, things went south with Bernie Madoff. That never manifested itself, and here we are in the year 2020, and Bobby Bonilla still getting $1.2 million. So congratulations to you, Bobby. I'm sure waking up today, looking in your bank account, pulling up that app on your smartphone, you felt much better than you did yesterday once again. But diving in here to segment number 1 of the Baseball Podcast, talking about the coronavirus in regards to Major League Baseball. Really, the big story that's come out over the past couple of days starts with the players who have started to opt out of the 2020 season. We talked about this very briefly in episodes past. Honestly, I didn't give a ton of thought to a lot of players opting out, just because the players I've spoken to haven't really suggested that a lot of individuals are thinking this way. So I don't think we're about to see a mass exit towards sitting out in 2020 based on the negotiations, based on what happened. But certainly now that there are 4 individuals, it has opened the gate for others to do likewise and maybe not feel as much guilt or being the first person. It's like when you're taking the test in high school or middle school and you find yourself finished and you're done and you look around and everybody else is still working on the test. And you're like, well, I can't hand this in right now because I'm not the smartest kid in class, so there's no way I just aced this exam faster than everybody else here. I definitely screwed this up. Let me look back through this. Well, now that 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 players have handed in their tests, it's much easier to get out of your seat and hand in your own. So the 4 names, I'm sure you guys have heard them out here by now, but if you have not, are Mike Leake, right-handed pitcher from the Diamondbacks. He's given up about $5 million this year. He was slated to be in the rotation for Arizona. He's just sitting out due to health concerns, obviously, with everything going on. He didn't give a specific example. Some other individuals have talked in specifics as to reasons why they are sitting out, such as Ian Desmond, who wrote a 9-page, I think you can call it a page or 9-post Instagram post. It was very long, and not until the last page or the last post was when he talked about how he was going to sit out this season. He talked a lot about the social injustice movement and everything that's happening right now, and he spoke about the culture in Major League Baseball clubhouses and dugouts being, not the most politically correct environments, and how some things are still acceptable in that environment, the quote-unquote locker room talk that may not be acceptable and commonplace or out when you're eating lunch, but he ultimately decided he was going to sit out. He has a pregnant wife. I believe it's his 5th child, and he's going to give up $5.5 million. So he wants to be at home. He wants to be there for his kids in a tough time economically, a tough time socially right now, and as well as with the health concerns and a pregnant wife. He didn't want to be out playing baseball, possibly getting exposed, missing the birth of his child because his exposure overlaps with the time his wife is going into birth, and that's just a risk based on everything he's weighing that he wasn't willing to take. So the final 2 names that have come out are both Washington Nationals. I found this interesting. 2 guys very much at the same time from the same team. Obviously, you think they're communicating with one another. Yes, one's a pitcher, one's a hitter, and a lot of times those relationships aren't the closest when it comes to Major League clubhouses, just because the bullpen guys tend to be doing their own thing for the most part and on their own time schedules. But Ryan Zimmerman, first baseman, the career franchise leader in home runs and RBIs, I believe, for the Washington Nationals, he basically stated that he has a high-risk wife that he is worried about in regards to exposure, and his wife travels with them on the road along with their family, so he doesn't want to possibly have that or them be exposed to the virus. He's only giving up about $740,000. He was looking at potentially his last ride in 2020 with the Washington Nationals. He has not stated that this means he is going to retire, and he is potentially looking at the option of playing in 2021, but he basically said at this point in his career, where his family is at, where his wife is at, the return on investment to ultimately play is not there right now. And then the last individual that we know of as of right now, Joe Ross, again, right-handed pitcher with the Nationals. He was in conversation for that number 5 starter. This will ultimately push back his free agency. Joe Ross is the only one of these individuals that is early on in his career, and essentially he's not going to earn his service time, so he is pushing back the clock a calendar year, both in arbitration and free agency. So I don't know how old he is. I didn't look that up before the show, but if he was going to be 29 at free agency, now he will be 30 years old, but he thinks staying healthy and not exposing himself ultimately in the long term will be the correct move for his career. So it's a very interesting conversation, and based on some feelers I have out there with people in the industry, players, there's a couple more coming. I'm not going to put a number on it. I'm not going to say it's going to be a lot of individuals. Again, my personal belief, that was the number would be very minimal. We haven't heard NHL players opting out when it comes to this point. We've heard now up to about 3 to 5, right around the same number of NBA players opting out of the Orlando potential restart, but a lot of that has to do with Florida being a hot spot for the coronavirus, and obviously Orlando being one of the hearts of Florida. So with Major League Baseball, there's just a lot of concern with the players with this travel, with not being able to play in a bubble due to local revenue, due to local television rights. Just the fact that potentially if you're on the New York Yankees, you could go down and play the Tampa Bay Devil Rays for a 3 or 4 game set down in Tampa, where the numbers are spiking. Things are growing again. They're basically shutting everything down for a second time in Florida, or beginning to shut everything down in Florida. Well, now you have to go from Tampa all the way up to Toronto to play the Blue Jays, where as of right now, there are still concerns due to the international rules when it comes to the coronavirus. The Canadian government in Toronto, anybody coming from outside of Canada needs to self-quarantine for 2 weeks. stay by themselves. And, of course, if you have a ball club of 30 players, however many coaches, however much medical staff, say 50, 60 guys, now they're going to come into your city. They're going to go right into a hotel, over to the stadium, back to the hotel, and expose pretty much almost the entire city because, again, we know how quickly this thing can spread. If somebody who works there gets caught, he goes home, he goes out to have some beers, I don't know, one of those types of trails, and now there's concern. So if I'm in Toronto, I'm not super thrilled with having Major League Baseball come back, having that essentially enter our city. And now there's rumors of the NHL hub cities being Toronto and Edmonton. So the city of Toronto is really about to experience a whirlwind here moving forward as Canada's had success with this virus, but now the Americans are trying to come and take over and say, hey, you guys have been doing so well. We're bringing half of our National Hockey League up to play here, as well as baseball is going to be coming in and out of this market, and teams are going to be coming in and out of this market almost every 3 to 4 days. So it'll be fascinating to see where ultimately those international guidelines or laws fall, if they can get a pass for that 14-day quarantine. Obviously, I believe they will, and they believe they will. They wouldn't have made it this far if they didn't think that ultimately they were going to be granted that access. But with coronavirus testing, there's a little bit of a catch-22 going on right now within Major League camps because players want full transparency. They want to know who has been tested, who is positive, who is negative, just because the exposure aspect. Again, a lot of these players may opt in and may play, but they think the owners owe it to them to be completely honest and transparent with who's been positive and essentially what their role has been in recent days. Now, on the ownership side of things, the waters are very murky because you have HIPAA and you have laws and healthcare laws to regulate, and multiple owners, multiple general managers have essentially come out and said, we can't give you, the media, any names due to these health laws. We have a coronavirus injured list. There's a standard IL and then a COVID-19 list that they could potentially be put on. But if you're put on this list, it doesn't automatically mean that you've had a positive test. It could potentially mean that you've been directly exposed to somebody who's had a positive test. But ultimately, if you end up on this list, you can use your judgment and your context clues to figure out if someone is positive, as well as if the player themselves voluntarily says, hey, I've tested positive, whether it's an Instagram post or through the team itself. Then, of course, you can share the information. So it comes back to players holding themselves accountable and essentially saying, if you get tested positive, you better basically give the okay to share your information, because we need to help each other and help this game continue to be played so we can get paid and we can put a good product on the field and make 2020 as successful as possible. So the owners are saying, hey, we can't tell you unless they give us the okay. And some individual players aren't okay with it. They don't want everybody to know then that they've come down with the virus. And I get that. I would certainly want to tell everybody, my family first before that's announced. I wouldn't want it coming out breaking news, Bob Nightingale tweets before you can let your wife and parents know. So certainly a fine line when it comes to the testing and the transparency with all of the results. So lastly, here in the first segment, I do want to talk about Rob Manfred one more time. I know we tend to bash this guy here on the GSMC Baseball Podcast. I tend to bash this guy, but my goodness, man, he came out again. He appeared on the Dan Patrick Show on Wednesday and basically said that the MLB season was never going to be longer than 60 games due to this coronavirus. He said, quote, "The reality is we weren't going to play more than 60 games no matter how the negotiations with the players went or any other factor. 60 games is the outside of the envelope given the responsibilities of the coronavirus, given the realities of the coronavirus. I think this is one thing we come back to every single day. We're trying to manage something that has proven to be unpredictable and unmanageable." So essentially, he's admitted that even though the owners made offers of 80 games, 72 games, their end goal has always been 60 games. And they knew all along that the players were not going to take a further pay cut. So even if they offer these games, we know they're not going to accept it. So we're just going to delay until we get to that time frame where 60 games make sense and we can move forward where we're comfortable with as ownership. And I know a grievance is coming from the players. I've spoken to multiple players that say, yeah, even if we don't win, we're going to file, or yes, of course, that's going to happen now based on, the past couple of months here. So it's known that that's going to happen. And Manfred, being a former lawyer, you would know has to be very careful with his words. And it just sounded like there in that quote, an admission of, yeah, we were never going to do that. We were never going to play 80 games, even if it was prorated cash. We were never going to play 70. It was always 60. This is where we wanted to be, and ultimately, it's where we got to. So it'll be fascinating to see if any of these conversations or interviews come back to bite these guys in the tail moving forward when the players and the owners go into a bit of a legal battle. But that'll wrap it up here for the first segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I do want to give a shout-out here at the end of the segment out to Crackerjack20. Crackerjack20 left us a review on Monday, a 5-star review titled Best Baseball Podcast in the Game. This podcast is always entertaining and full of great content. I can't wait to listen when baseball is actually being played. Well, Crackerjack, I can't wait to do this podcast when baseball is actually being played. But shout out to you. Thank you very much for the 5-star review. We appreciate the love here at the GSMC Baseball Podcast. And if you're listening and you haven't given us a review yet, head to Apple Podcasts, leave us 5 stars, write a review. I'll read it here on the show. I appreciate everybody listening out there very much. But once again, that wraps it up for the first segment. We're going to pause right now for a word from one of our sponsors, one of our sister shows. But when we come back, we're going to dive into the minor leagues. It's now official. There's going to be no minor leagues in 2020. It's very sad. So stick around. I am Kevin Mahalik. This is the GSMC Baseball Podcast.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Welcome back, and thanks for listening to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik, and this is episode number 202 of the Baseball Podcast here on Thursday, July 2nd. Hopefully everybody is getting ready for a July 4th holiday weekend out there. Most of us are able to enjoy Friday being off from work. I know there are some individuals out there who still have to report for duty. So shout out to you. We very much appreciate it, whether it's healthcare, police, firefighters, whatever it is, whatever you're doing. If you're at the office even on Friday, working extra hours, shout out to you. We appreciate everything you're doing for us. But hopefully enjoy a 4th weekend, being safe out there with your family and friends. If you are going to get together, try to practice social distancing, wash your hands, wear your mask. Do all of the above, and I just ask this because I want to watch baseball at the end of the month. We're 3 weeks away here, getting very, very close, and I just couldn't take it if it got shut down. But diving into segment number 2, talking about being shut down, ultimately the minor league system. Minor league baseball, it became official on Tuesday, June 30th, that the minor leagues are being shut down for the year. They are canceled. And the head of the minor leagues came out and basically said that more than half of the 160 teams won't make it financially without assistance from the government or private equity. And basically saying that AA and AAA organizations should be okay. 90% of them are affiliated with a Major League Baseball organization and therefore will be fine when it comes to financials. It's talking about some of those AA programs, a lot of the single A, high A, mid A, low A rookie ball teams. Again, 160 of them. You're talking about half, 2 to 3 per team. If that's the case, if you go to 3 per team, you're looking at low A, mid A, high A, not even counting rookie ball because a lot of times those are under the Major League umbrella. And it's very unfortunate because teams such as Williamsport, the Williamsport Crosscutters in the Philadelphia organization, Lakewood is another one. Potentially Clearwater could be affected, but the likes of Williamsport, that's obviously known as a baseball town. The Little League World Series is there every summer. Recently in Major League Baseball, they've had games there during the Little League World Series. It was the Phillies the one year, the Pirates another year. I think they had that planned again this summer. Obviously, it will not be taking place, and the Little League World Series will not be taking place as well in Williamsport. But the Crosscutters are big for the economy in Williamsport. So there's a ton of local economies that are going to be affected, jobs, individuals that are going to be affected unless there's government assistance when it comes to trying to keep these organizations or businesses afloat, because 85 to 90% of revenue from minor league baseball teams comes from game day related activities, comes from ticket sales, beer sales, concession sales, merchandise sales, parking sales, anything that comes with day-to-day operations. 85 to 90% of their revenue. And that's because a lot of these games aren't on television. They don't have TV deals. They don't have national deals. They don't have regional deals. They don't have money coming from the media side of things. So entirely operations come from games. And their entire income comes from the month of April to the month of August. They're one of these operations thinking like farmers out there where, hey, basically our crop comes April, May, June, July, August, it's done. And then our income or our crops from those months need to last us the next 6 to 8 months until the crops come back again, until the players come back again and we have games. And financially, they've been able to do this because if you think about it, maybe 5,000 tickets a game. Let's see, $20 a ticket if we're going average. $100,000 just in tickets, beer, all the other $200,000 a game. You're looking at least 50 home games. It's a lot of money that these people are not going to be able to realize this year. And we've seen some stadiums try to put on concerts or become an Airbnb or hold business. I don't know, networking events. It's just crazy what they're trying to do, but they're really not going to make it. And this would be the first summer where there hasn't been a minor league season since 1901. Even during the pandemic of 1918, 1919, there was one league that was able to get games in and finish. Even through World War I and a pandemic, the minor leagues were able to play over 100 years ago. Entirely through World War II. Entirely through everything else that has gone on. And 2020 is the first year that minor league baseball will not be a thing in 119, 120 years. Just fascinating to think about how different the world is back then and everything it's gone through and where it is now. And for the first time in 120 years for something not to happen just kind of makes you realize the magnitude of the situation and really where our world has evolved to with economies and with people and interacting and how things, when they come to a halt, just change society as a whole. And now as humans, as business people, as individuals, we have to adapt. We have to adapt to the market. We have to adapt to different possibilities that we never thought were possible. Can there be minor leagues in 2021? It's going to be a fascinating conversation because I think we've seen the end of minor league baseball as we know it. We know as of a couple of years ago, even as recently as 6 months ago, Major League Baseball was looking to dismantle the minor league system and eliminate up to 40 teams cutting it back from 160 to 120, basically taking it from 5 teams to 4 teams for every organization. Yes, those numbers aren't exact, but that's what they were looking at. And they couldn't do this right off the bat because not all minor league organizations are owned by the major league organizations. They have agreements based on affiliation, based on roster usage and facility usage and scheduling and things like that. But they are third-party organizations that are run on their own that have contractual agreements with the big league clubs, like the Cubs or the Dodgers or whoever it is. It doesn't matter. But now, the economic situation in minor league baseball being where it is, this is even more incentive for those owners to come together and say, hey, we need to try to hitch our wagon to Major League Baseball organizations and to their money, because we've just found that no matter how successfully we run this minor league baseball business, if something like a pandemic comes up, we are out of a job. We are out of business. We don't have income. We don't have a fallback. We don't have government assistance right now to keep us going. We need that parent company with a lot of money to come in and stabilize and be able to keep us afloat. So now Major League Baseball has all the power because, yes, these teams that are affiliated with them are very comfortable knowing that, hey, we're going to be fine, such as the Reading Fightin' Phils and the Lehigh Valley Iron Pigs for the Philadelphia Phillies, the AA and AAA affiliate. They're fine. But a lot of single-A teams and a lot of smaller AA teams elsewhere are now finding themselves kind of fishing for that parent company or for that money. And Major League Baseball is certainly going to take advantage of this. If there's anything we've seen over the past 30, 60, 90 days, it's that they don't have a lot of empathy. They're not really going to look at the player side and say, okay, we're going to wear it on this one. Let's give them what they want. And they're not going to do that when it comes to minor league business and owning a baseball team either. These guys are strictly by the book, strictly by the dollar, really looking at how to make minor leagues more efficient. So if they come in and take everything over, which day by day here looks more and more likely because the current construct of minor league baseball won't make it through this financially, Major League Baseball comes in and essentially blows the entire thing up and starts all over. Yes, there's going to be some stability and some of the same format. I always mention the Phillies, but Lehigh Valley, Reading, and Philadelphia are all within an hour, hour and a half of each other. AA, AAA, and the bigs. That's going to be the same, but that's the ideal model. It really is. That's what every team is going to be looking for because Major League Baseball is going to be looking to cut costs every way possible. After what's happening here in 2020, and if we don't have a vaccine in time for 2021, the same thing's going to happen. So the costs of the taxi squad, the cost of guys going up and down from AAA, the cost of the bullpen. Thinking back to some of my relationships in the past, to the Minnesota Twins, obviously in Minneapolis, AAA, Rochester, New York. Not a bus ride from each other. For guys in the bullpen going up and down every 15 days at a minimum, 2.5 weeks sometimes. Rochester, Minneapolis, you're in a suitcase, you're in a hotel in Rochester, and you're back to Minneapolis. You can't even get a house in Minneapolis because you don't know how many times you're going to go back and forth, so you're just living out of a suitcase in an apartment, then you're living out of a suitcase in a hotel, then an apartment, then a hotel, and back and forth. Well, now, even if you're at the Phillies, you get sent down, you can still live in Philadelphia and drive to Allentown every day. Nick Pivetta did it last summer after they sent him down. It's an hour-and-a-half commute, but it can be done. So you can still live at home, sleep in the same bed, be comfortable, get the most out of your development. And this is what Major League Baseball is gonna look to do. So they're going to get control of all of the minor leagues. They're going to reduce the number of teams. Again, the rumored number has been 120, down from 160. But they're also going to shuffle affiliations. The Phillies will be fine, but there's other teams like Rochester, New York. You can't tell me there's a big league club closer than that than the Minneapolis, Minnesota Twins that you can get affiliated with. The New York Mets are another one. Their AAA team is in Las Vegas. Vegas to New York, up and down in the bullpen. No wonder your bullpen stinks. Guys are going from Vegas, different time zones, trying to manage the internal clock every 2 weeks. throw. You're going there. You're traveling back in time. Then you're going pitching later that night for the AAA team. It just makes no sense. Give them Rochester. But because of the affiliation changes, and even sometimes going from AA to AAA, depending on facilities, there's some AAA teams and facilities that are very, very run down, older, kind of smaller, and then some super nice AA facilities that could switch and change levels there. Well, if you're doing all of that stuff, that, of course, leads to entire restructure of leagues. The entire International League that we know about, the other league, what is it out there? The Pacific League, I believe, in the AAA level. They're going to be just wiped out. They're just going to start over, and they're not going to be named those things, in my opinion. We're going to go East, Central, or West. But, again, they're going to want less amounts of travel during the minor league systems because now they're in charge of all of the economics. So what are they going to do? Cut the most cost possible. There's going to be very minimal plane rides, probably even at the AAA level from now on. It's going to be a lot of bus rides for the entirety of the minor league system. And then the AA level, maybe they'll get away from 12-hour bus rides and it won't be longer than an 8-hour bus ride. So at that point, it'll be a positive for the players. You will have less travel, less overnights. Maybe you'll be bussing back and forth overnight. After the third game, it's not 12 hours back. It's only 6 hours back and you're sleeping in your own bed by 2 a.m. instead of 5 a.m. the next day. But the owners are going to look to be geographically efficient as much as possible. And honestly, it's something that I've been saying for years. I really didn't understand as a college kid, post-college, the economic business side of baseball, and I really didn't care or think to do a little bit of research into it. But as I got older, as I'm getting more involved in the sport here, as I'm continuing to dive in and learn some of the behind the scenes of what's going on, just having teams, Minneapolis to New York to Vegas, and they're not the only two in Major League Baseball. It was just always fascinating to hear that so-and-so's been called up and they're throwing tonight. Well, how do you think they're going to perform after being on a plane for 3 hours, but getting up here, driving to the airport, getting on the airplane, going where they need to be, landing, going to the ballpark, and then trying to perform at a high level? It just doesn't make a ton of sense. And the Phillies always being able to, hey, we called this guy up based on an injury from AAA, but he's going to be here in an hour because he just hopped in his car and it's down the turnpike. So he's going to be here at 6 o'clock before 7 o'clock first pitch. Yeah, it's still crazy, but not as outlandish as a full day of travel, different time zones, elevations, whatever it may be. Just fascinating. But it really will be wild to see the minor leagues as we know it. They are gone for sure. Not going to be the same. There's going to be less teams. So if you live in a city out there that had a lower level minor league team, I'm rooting for you to keep that one out there, but I don't know ultimately who it's going to be, and I'm not going to try to make any guesses. So we'll have to wait and see. This really isn't at the forefront of anybody's minds in baseball. They're really worried about 2020 and the coronavirus, obviously, but still just a sad day when it comes to baseball and having no minor leagues here in 2020. But that'll wrap it up here for the second segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik, as always, and when we come back, we're going to talk about any prospects that can actually make a difference this year. Last week, we talked about Cy Youngs and MVPs. Well, this year, I want to talk about the kids, or this episode, I want to talk about the kids who could make a difference that maybe wouldn't have during a regular summer. It's some quality conversation, so stick around, everybody. Kevin Mahalik, the GSMC Baseball Podcast. We'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back, everybody, to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Kevin Mahalik, and this is episode number 202 of the Baseball Podcast, Thursday, July 2nd. If you're listening to this over the holiday weekend, I appreciate you guys tuning in. Normally, we'd have a ton of baseball to talk about over July 4th. This would be a great barometer of where we're at for the year. You'd be April, May, June, 3 months in, about the halfway pole. Can we contend? Are we for real? We'd be talking pretenders and contenders. I'd be talking about how the Phils started fast and then have since faded and now are back around 500. Or no, this year would have been different. That's right. I'm going to be confident. This year would have been different. But, man, it's a shame for sure not having baseball this weekend, not even having spring training, inter-squad baseball to discuss. Really just 1 week away here from everybody reporting in baseball getting back to as close to regular as possible. But before we dive into the third segment here, I'm going to take the time to ask you to follow us on social media. Head to Facebook, head to Instagram, Twitter. Follow the GSMC Baseball Podcast as well as the GSMC Podcast Network. If you guys haven't checked out the rest of the podcast network yet, please do that now. I know you're listening on Apple Podcasts. Go down to the search bar. Type in GSMC. You'll find all the different podcasts. There's a book podcast, news, movies, music, politics, sports, anything, cars, whatever it is. There's a podcast for you guys to check out. And with over 17 million downloads in the month of June last month across the network, shout out to all of you guys because I know you are listening out there. That's a ton of downloads. We appreciate the love here at the podcast network for sure, and we're going to continue to do our best to bring you guys quality content moving forward. But jumping into segment number 3 here of the Baseball Podcast, like I talked about last segment, I want to discuss with you guys if there are any prospects from these current 60-man rosters who could actually come in and play well, who could actually come in, win some ball games for some teams. And there's two groups to classify these particular prospects in. And the first one is players who are already close enough that would have made an appearance in a regular 162-game summer. Guys like Gavin Lux or A.J. Puck, Dustin May, those people have been up. I didn't put them on this list. But individuals who are very, very close and probably would have been up either after their service time had hit or may have made the opening day roster anyway to get off the prospect list. That's this first group of individuals we're going to talk about here, starting off with Luis Robert, center fielder for the White Sox, a top 5 prospect, depending on who you're looking at. If we're looking at ESPN's rankings, that's the resource that I used here based on the numbers that I'm going to say to you guys. But he signed a long-term deal with the White Sox. He was one of those prospects that signed long-term for stability, maybe gave up some dollars ultimately on the back end if performance lives up to the hype, but truly now has stability for his family and guaranteed money. So you can't really argue with the fact that you signed that deal early and then you find yourself still entering free agency at a young age. So Nate Pearson, a right-handed pitcher with the Blue Jays, he was number 6 on the prospect list. He was turning heads this spring. He has a fastball that can reach 100 mile an hour. He may not be in the rotation this summer. He may not be on the roster right out of camp. He could be one of those guys that's held back for a week due to service time. But the Blue Jays certainly, and we're going to touch on it in this last segment when we talk about over-under win results that have since been released. But the Blue Jays are not ultimately assumed to be competitive. So Nate Pearson coming up, throwing triple digits. He'll be up sooner than later when it comes to this summer. Joe Adell, a right fielder for the Angels, number 10, their next big prospect out in L.A. Another reason why I think L.A. could be a surprise team out west. He's number 10 on ESPN's prospect list. He did struggle a little bit at AAA last year, struggled to really hit for power, find his stroke there. He didn't have any home runs in 120 at-bats or so. So he might not be ready yet when it comes to big league pitching. was a little bit overpowered at the AAA level, but ultimately I think this kid can play. He's going to find himself and at the very least be a solid contributor for the LA Angels. Next up, Matt Manning, number 13, Casey Mize, number 14, and Tariq Skubal, all the way down to number 79. But the Detroit Tigers, they're all three starting pitchers. All three could find themselves in the rotation by some point this summer. Detroit has one of the lowest win totals in the league, so they're very much going to be out of it and going to look to get the kids experience as little as they may get, but certainly big league experience in kind of a wasted season is what you're looking at in Detroit. You have Christian Patch, center fielder for the Braves. The Braves have a ton of outfield options: Marcelo Zuna, Ender Inciarte, Ronald Acuna Jr., but if you slide Ozuna to DH, maybe Patch can hop out there in center field occasionally. Won't be in the everyday lineup, but certainly gives them some depth, and they're going to want him playing games to continue his development. Forrest Whitley, a right-handed pitcher for the Astros, number 25 overall prospect. He lost his season in 2019 due to injury, but Garrett Cole and Wade Miley moved on in Arizona. So certainly Forrest could find himself contributing to the Astros team sooner than later. Dylan Carlson, an outfielder for the Cardinals. He hit .292 in the minors. Still is just 21. St. Louis has some outfield holes, so look for Carlson to possibly have a big year. He could find himself in the lineup as early as week 1, potentially on how St. Louis wants to play things, but that's a guy who could swing things in favor of St. Louis this summer. Nick Madrigal, second baseman, 47th overall prospect, one of the best contact hitters in all of the minor leagues. He only struck out 16 times in 532 plate appearances. He should take over for second base in Chicago. Obviously a tough out when it comes to pitching against this guy. He's going to put the ball in play. He's going to make you make a play. It'll be fascinating to see if he can turn in any sort of power or if he'll just be a contact hitter at the big league level too. Sixto Sanchez, right-handed pitcher for the Marlins, number 55 overall. He was the prize of the JT Realmuto deal, came over from the Phillies. It looks like they're going to want to see what he can do. He can reach triple digits, easy 95, 97. I was definitely upset when the Fightin' Phils moved on from him. He was the prize in that deal, and he's going to be fun to watch in Miami for a few years to come. Lastly, here in this group, I have Evan White, first baseman for the Mariners, number 64. He signed a long-term deal with the Mariners as well, so he'll be the starter at first base from the get-go, just like Luis Robert of the White Sox. But that's 11 guys who were going to be up eventually, but now will be up right away. So for those of you in the markets like Chicago, like Toronto, LA, Detroit, as well as Miami or Seattle, if you're like, man, I don't really want to check out this ball club anyway, we're going to stink this year, we're tanking for 2021, it's only 60 games, well, check out some of these kids, because if a few of them get hot, if the couple of White Sox kids figure things out, maybe you win some games, you find yourself in a pennant race coming down the stretch. But even more importantly, I think this next group of 6 individuals, these are the guys that probably wouldn't have contributed during a normal summer, would have found themselves probably at the AA, AAA level, maybe a September call-up here and there, but ultimately really not ready to contribute. But now, based on the fact that you're not going to have minor league baseball, and you're going to put them on the 60-man roster, so at the very least, if they're shoving during inter squads, you can call them up and have them participate. These are the guys that I'm excited to check out here. Starting off with Wander Franco, shortstop for the Tampa Bay Rays, number 1 overall prospect. He's never played above A-ball, and Willie Adams is a really good defensive shortstop. But maybe they bring in Franco to play a little second base. Maybe they put him at third base. Maybe he DHs for a game or two just to get some big league at-bats and, dip the toe in the water. Obviously, playing above A-ball, it's a huge jump from A-ball to the big leagues. But you're going against the Orioles. It's the 5th starter. Maybe it's not the worst idea in the world for him to get 2 to 3 at-bats. See a big league breaking ball. See a big league fastball. And maybe he rakes. Who knows? But Joey Bart, catcher for the Giants, former number 2 overall pick. He's the number 5 prospect now. The Giants have just 4 catchers in their entire player pool. 2 of them are veteran minor leaguers, Rob Brantley and Tyler Henneman. So Bart could serve as Buster Posey's primary backup, especially after the first couple of weeks, because when you're looking at service time and the quote-unquote manipulation of service time that's happened with Chris Bryant and a lot of other individuals, well, now when you shorten the season down to 60 games, this is still the case, but it's only a week. So after 7 days, a lot of these individuals could get called up because they will not reach that limit for service time to be credited for an entire season. So Joey Bart could find himself on the taxi squad for a week, and then after a week, he's the primary backup to Buster Posey, who's getting up there in age and certainly going to need a blow. So Bart could end up playing for the Giants more than he thinks coming down the stretch. We also have Mackenzie Gore, left-handed pitcher for the Padres, number 8 overall. He's made just 5 starts above A-ball, but he's a polished, big left-handed pitcher. He could start now for the Padres, and if he gets hot, he gets rolling, he gets cooking, I'm going to be interested to watch, man. And the Padres got another one. They got a lot of young kids on this roster that they're going to want to get into game action. Now, are the kids ready to perform at an extremely high level? Potentially not, and that's why the Padres aren't at the top of the list. But Luis Patino, a right-handed pitcher, the number 11 prospect. He's logged just 2 starts above Class A ball. He's not nearly as refined as Gore, but his fastball-slider combo could make him an effective reliever in short outings. He's got 2+ pitches, doesn't have that third or the control that you're looking for a starting pitcher. Mackenzie Gore has more of those qualities, but if you're looking for a reliever, a top fastball, tough slider, come in, face 3 hitters, since it's a 3-batter minimum now, but could be fun to watch. Jarek Kelenic, center fielder for the Mariners, only 21 games above A-ball, but with a couple of injuries, they could consider giving him a bunch of at-bats out there in Seattle, especially if they struggle out of the gate like a lot of people are predicting them to. Not a strong summer out in Seattle, at least according to the experts. And lastly, Spencer Howard, right-handed pitcher for the Phillies, number 21. He hasn't thrown above AA ball, I believe. Maybe had a start or 2 at AAA. But they need rotation help. So after a week or 2, if you're looking at the likes of Nola, Wheeler, Arrieta, and then Spencer Howard, if he comes in and he's a solid number 4, he would obviously have been on an innings limit, but now with only 60 games, maybe 10 starts, 5-6 innings a start, 60 innings, he can go full bore and give you all he's got, along with the rest of these guys, all of these pitchers. No longer on innings limits, and they're going to be able to give you high intensity from the get-go. So those are the prospects that could make a difference here this summer. Wrapping up the third segment, let's talk about a few free agents that are still out there, according to Major League Baseball. Starting off with Yasiel Puig. Yasiel Puig's the biggest name out on the block. He hit .267 last year combined between a couple of teams with 24 home runs and 84 RBIs. Everybody knows Yasiel Puig and his personality and the way he plays the game could frustrate some people. It's a high-risk, high-reward game. But he's a solid contributor. He contributed for Cleveland down the stretch last year. So I wouldn't be too surprised if he ends up on a ball club here, even if it's a week or 2 into spring training, maybe an injury or another player or 2 opt out. Once Ian Desmond opt out, they thought about Yasiel Puig going to Colorado, but then they signed Matt Kemp off of Miami's quote-unquote practice squad or 60-man squad, but not 40-man roster. So Matt Kemp will now be out in Colorado and not be with the Miami Marlins organization. But it's a thin free agency pool here if you're looking at major league level talent for the year 2020, because we got the likes of Scooter Gennett at second base. He was injured most of last year, hit .234, only 2 homers, 6 RBIs, not many games whatsoever for Scooter. There's Fernando Rodney, relief pitcher. He's getting up there. I think he's 44 or 45 almost. He had a 4.28 ERA last year, so still somewhat effective, but certainly not your 7th, 8th, 9th inning guy. He would be a depth piece early on in the year with the expanded roster. Certainly a good option in the 12th or something, or the extras, but he can become a walk fest and frustrating to watch. And then you got the likes of Tim Beckham, who hit .237 last year, 15 homers, 47 RBIs. He can be used all around the infield. He's certainly a utility guy All of these individuals have below average WARs or wins above replacements. They're below average when it comes to their positions. Lucas Duda coming off an injury, but potentially could provide some pop for a National League team looking for a DH or a pinch hitter off the bench late. And I don't know, are pinch hitters still a thing? Now that there's designated hitters, do you pinch hit for the DH? I guess if there's a righty-lefty matchup, but not going to happen as much with the National League pitchers not hitting here this summer. But that'll wrap it up, guys, for the third segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. When we come back here after a word from one of our sponsors and one of our sister shows, we're going to talk about the over-unders. Vegas has released the win total, the over-under for all 30 teams. We're going to discuss those, kind of reference it back to our power rankings. I'm looking forward to this one. It's going to be a lot of fun. So I am your host, Kevin Mahalik, and this is the GSMC Baseball Podcast. We'll be right back, everybody.
Want to know the latest in soccer? Then listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast. From MLS, the World Cup, and the Premier League, we've got you covered. The latest updates, the hottest matches, and news on the league's top players. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Soccer Podcast.
David Beckham scores the goal to take England all the way to the World Cup finals.
Listen now.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Baseball Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, as always, Kevin Mahalik, and this is episode number 202 of the Baseball Podcast. I appreciate everybody listening in. If you're joining us here on a holiday weekend, once again, happy July 4th to everybody out there. Hopefully you're enjoying your fireworks, staying safe. I know a lot of the townships or local firework displays have been shut down, but you're still able to shoot them off locally, individually, if you're abiding by XYZ rules. So if you're shooting fireworks off out there, and I've heard them outside of my house here tonight on July 1st, late Wednesday, so some people are already enjoying themselves as of Wednesday night. Thursday, back to work one last time this week, but Friday off into the weekend. Stay safe out there, everybody. I know you're going to want to get together with your families, whether it's at the beach, at the shore, at the barbecue, or the picnic. But please stay safe. Try to social distance. Wash your hands. Use your mask. Do what you can. I just ask you because, again, I just want to see baseball in 3 weeks, everybody. I want to talk to you guys about baseball. But that's what we're doing here in the fourth and final segment. Vegas has come out with the over-unders. Now that we have a 60-game season, they've reworked the algorithms, come out with the over-unders. I know sports gambling not legal in all 50 states, but here in Pennsylvania where I'm at, it is legal. So I tend to enjoy myself from time to time. It is becoming more regulated and more legal out there. But I want to talk about the over-unders for every team, kind of run through the divisions, talk about how it lines up with our power rankings, and ultimately what Vegas thinks the outcome's going to be this summer if everything goes according to plan. So starting out with the American League East, from worst to first, they have the Baltimore Orioles with an over-under of 20.5. So essentially going 20-40 in Baltimore. Next up, they got the Toronto Blue Jays, 27.5. Next, third place, Boston Red Sox, 31.5. Second place, Tampa Bay Rays at 34. And in first place, of course, the New York Yankees at 37.5, which is the highest in the American League. So the Yankees 37.5, leading the division in the American League East, which again will put them into the playoffs, which we'll talk about later. So a 3-team race in the AL East, really a 2-team battle between Tampa Bay and New York. When it comes to Vegas, I thought Boston's number of 31.5 was a bit high. I would put them closer to Toronto's 27.5, but no arguments with New York or Tampa Bay when it comes to there. So looking at the American League Central, worst to first, fifth place, Detroit Tigers, 22. Fourth place, Kansas City Royals, 25. And then these next three are the teams that are battling. The Chicago White Sox, my surprise team in the American League, 31.5. The Cleveland Indians, 32.5 in second place. And then first, the Minnesota Twins at 34. So the Minnesota Twins, your favorites in the American League Central, trailed by the Cleveland Indians and the Chicago White Sox. So if you find yourselves being an Indians fan or even a White Sox fan, I think the Indians would have good value at hitting the over, which puts them at good value to win the American League Central. Shortened season, competition, rotation, I think that could advance them beyond Minnesota. With the White Sox, depending on how these kids perform, that's ultimately where we're going to see what breaks down and which way they go. But 31.5, honestly, I thought was high. I think that's more along the lines where I have them, right on playoff consideration. We've talked in episodes past about how we found that 32 and 28 will either put you in as a wild card or tied or one game out, but 32 is kind of that sweet spot when it comes to the playoffs. So having Chicago right on the fringe at 31.5, that's right where I put them. So shout out to Vegas, me and you, feeling good about the White Sox. The AL West, and let's see, worst to first, Seattle, 23.5, Texas, 28.5, and then the top three, LA, the Angels, 31, Oakland, 32.5, and the Houston Astros at 35. So, breaking down the American League, we have the New York Yankees with the best record in baseball. They'll face off against the wild card winner, which leaves the other two division winners of Houston versus Minnesota. Houston at 35, Minnesota at 34. Houston having home field advantage. So Vegas still very high on the Astros winning the AL West, even though everything we've seen them go through here in this past offseason. But looking at the wild card, it's close in the American League, but not as close as the National League. So right now you'd have Tampa Bay at 34 wins. They're a cut above every other wild card contender. And then you have the Cleveland Indians. They are tied with the Oakland Athletics at 32.5. That would put those two battling each other to see ultimately who would play Tampa in the actual wild card game with the likes of the Chicago White Sox and Boston Red Sox at 31.5. So according to Vegas, we got Tampa, Cleveland, and Oakland, the leaders in the clubhouse, to be those wild card teams. In Houston, Minnesota, I would be fascinated to watch that one. Honestly, I think it would be a lot of fun. And then give me New York and Tampa on the other side. New York, Houston, potentially in the ALCS. So, but looking at the American League in its entirety, it's really three teams per division, right? In the American League East, they're saying Boston, Tampa, New York potentially have playoff aspirations. In the Central, Chicago White Sox, Cleveland, and Minnesota. And the White Sox are going to be a surprise for some of you guys listening out there. And then in the West, Houston and Oakland with L.A. really kind of right on the outside. So the American League is a lot of the standard cast of characters that we've seen in the past, and there's really no surprises or battles that seem to be won outside of Cleveland and Tampa and Oakland battling for those wild card spots. But in the National League, it's different, man. It is really, really tight. So starting out with the National League East, worst to first, the Miami Marlins, they're in the league of their own. They're in the basement at 24.5. These top four teams, very, very close to each other. You have the New York Mets at 31.5 and the Philadelphia Phillies at 31.5. So they'll be tied for third place. Second place, you have Washington at 33. And then in first place, just ahead of them, Atlanta at 33.5. Personally, I think Atlanta is much better than Washington. If I had to do these numbers, I'd put Atlanta at 34, Washington at 33, Philly at 32, and then New York at 31.5. I just think New York losing Thor really is going to be a differentiator when it comes to the NL East. But having three teams all within a game and a half and four teams within 2 games of each other certainly tells you that it's going to be neck and neck all the way down to the end, because playing 40 games within your division, the last 5, 10, 15 games, I would assume. Again, we don't have a schedule release yet from Major League Baseball. They're still working out the logistics and the finer details of this schedule. But if you're going to have 4 teams within 2 games, that literally means those games at the end of the year are going to mean everything. And that's what Major League Baseball is looking for this summer. They're looking for divisional races to go down to the end. They're looking for Miami to be involved in these divisional races. They want this year to be as wacky as possible just because that'll bring in as many fans and new fans as they can, because they'll say, hey, this team was going to tank and they would have stank over 162 games, but now over 60, they got hot for a couple weeks and they're making a run. So don't look now, but Miami's got a chance to make the playoffs, and this would never happen in a normal year. So transitioning now to the NL Central, once again, very evenly matched up outside of one team, and that's the Pittsburgh Pirates. I'm sorry to all my Pirates fans out there, and I know I have some of you listening to the podcast because you've commented and left reviews in the past. Pitt fan something or other, I believe it was, and we had a Yinzer respond the one time. But, man, your Pirates, 25.5, just outside of the basement when it comes to the National League. So the Marlins are in the basement at 24.5, followed by the Pirates at 25.5. And then everybody else bundled up once again in the NL Central. You have Milwaukee, 30.5, fourth place. Second and third, Cincinnati and St. Louis, 31.5. And then the Chicago Cubs at 32.5. And honestly, this entire division surprised me when I was looking at it. The Cubs at 32.5, I think is way too high. I think the Cubs are a year past their prime, or a year past where they would have been. They're going to be looking to unload players. But, hey, now that it's 60 games, maybe these guys get hot. They find themselves right in the mix. It's just crazy to think of the differences and the variance that can happen from one division to another, or from one year to another when it comes to 160 to 60. But the Cubbies at 32.5, I thought was very high for them. I don't think they're the favorite to win this division. Personally, I would put that with St. Louis. So I think St. Louis at 31.5 is very low. I would take the over for the St. Louis Cardinals, because if you have the Cardinals as even as the Reds, that either means you're extremely high on the Reds or extremely low on the Cardinals. And honestly, I'm extremely high on the Reds. So both of my surprise teams, if you've been listening to the podcast here for a couple of months now, in the American League, I'm taking the White Sox, and in the National League, I'm taking the Reds. Well, Vegas putting them both at 31.5 when we know 32 games can make you to the playoffs. Baby, I'm right there with you, Vegas. I'm seeing what you're seeing. Cincinnati, 31.5. That's probably on the high end. St. Louis, 31.5 on the low end. I think Milwaukee's right there around 30. But I would put the Cubbies right there around 30 as well. So I would add one or two from St. Louis and take that from Chicago. But again, coming down the stretch here, these teams are going to be playing each other for pretty much every day out of the last 2 weeks of the year. And there's nothing more than Major League Baseball wants than a 3-game series between the Reds and the Cardinals, and then the Cardinals and the Cubs, and all of them chasing each other, watching each other, both fans watching both markets. That means you have 4 markets involved out of 5 in the National League East, 4 markets out of 5 involved in the National League Central, and then only 3 markets out of 5 probably in the National League West as we wrap it up here. But worst to first, you got the San Francisco Giants over under at 25. Next up, the Colorado Rockies at 27.5. In third place, San Diego at 30.5. Second place, Arizona at 31. And first place, the LA Dodgers at 38. So really only 3 markets out there in the West. Only one of them, because the Dodgers are the best team in baseball, according to the over-under. The Yankees were at 37.5. The Dodgers at 38. So projected to get the most wins when it comes to the regular season. But those other 2 teams, Arizona and San Diego, their over-unders are both under what would qualify for the wild card performance. So if everything goes to plan here, according to the National League, you would have LA, of course, as the 1 seed, playing the wild card winner. And then you would have the Braves winning the National League East by half a game. And the St. Louis Cardinals, or no, the Chicago Cubs, that's right, winning the NL Central. I said it would be the Cardinals, but the Cubs win in this instance. You have the Washington Nationals, clearly, as the first wild card, only finishing a half a game behind the division-winning Atlanta Braves. But the second wild card, this is where we have some fun. We have ourselves a 4-way tie for the second wild card, and then one team half a game back and another team 2 other teams 1 game back. So we have 7 teams within 1 game of the second wild card team. Those teams would be the New York Mets, 31.5, Philadelphia Phillies, 31.5, Cincinnati Reds, 31.5, St. Louis Cardinals, 31.5. Then you have the Milwaukee Brewers, 30.5, and the Padres at 30.5, with the Arizona Diamondbacks squeezed in the middle at 31 over/under, which is way more teams and way more markets, much more evenly matched than what we saw in the American League when it came to the over/under. It really came down to Cleveland or Oakland for that second wild card spot. Well, in the National League, they're saying, hey, the Phillies have a shot, the Mets got a shot, the Reds, Cardinals, all of these teams have a chance, not only within their division, because we think they're 2 games away from actually winning the division, but also the wild card. And if you're in the National League West, you may not win the division, but you're fighting against all 10 of these other teams from the Central and the East, because 8 out of 10 of them are in the playoff race coming down the stretch. So just fascinating to think about. 32 is that, magic number we've seen when it comes to years past. 32 and 28 would have you qualify for the playoffs in most seasons. So if you get to 33, 34 wins, you've had yourself a really good year. And of course, with the highest total with the Dodgers at 38, I think it would be extremely difficult to get to 40 and 20 and win 2 out of 3 every time. But that was a lot of fun. Hopefully you enjoyed that out there. If you have some strong intuition one way or the other, you can find yourself, if you're in a state where sports gambling is legal, you can find yourself gambling. I don't know if I'm going to put some down on my Fightin' Phils, but like I said, the Cardinals, I may take the over on there and the under on the Cubbies. Maybe parlay it, try to make some cash. But that'll wrap it up here for the 4th and final segment of the GSMC Baseball Podcast. I'll ask you guys one more time before we head out. Please head to social media. Follow the GSMC Baseball Podcast, as well as the GSMC Podcast Network, as well as wherever you're listening to this. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play. We're on all of them. Please leave a 5-star rating, write a review. Shout out to CrackerJack20, who left a 5-star review in between last episode and this one. If you guys write a review, we'll read them here on the show. As always, it helps us spread the word. It helps us continue to grow and continue to bring quality content to you guys, the listeners out there. But that'll wrap it up today for episode 202 of the GSMC Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Kevin Mahalik. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you guys again on Monday. Have a good weekend.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Baseball Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.